Part 1: The Man Who Shouldn't Have Survived, Helicopter Pilot Story. For almost 20 years now, I've flown helicopters for the Utah Department of Public Safety. Most people hear that and picture the obvious. Me in a flight suit, rotor spinning, hovering over cops on the ground like some tactical movie. That's part of it, sure. But the reality is a lot messier and much stranger. We support law enforcement, yeah, but we also do medical evacuations, wildfire response, natural disaster support, and most relevant to this story, search and rescue in the Rocky Mountains. I'm on call 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. That means sometimes I'm halfway through dinner or knocked out in bed at 2 a.m. when the phone goes off and I'm grabbing my gear heading into the dark because someone out there has pushed their luck too far. A lot of those calls come from the Uinta-Wasatch Cache National Forest. About 30 miles east of Salt Lake. Locals just call it the UWC. It's beautiful, rugged country, and it eats unprepared people alive. Most of the time, the calls are simple enough. A hiker twisted an ankle, a climber fell and shattered a leg. A skier triggered a small avalanche and is now screaming into a half-dead phone. We go up, we find them, we bring them home. But sometimes I fly into situations that feel like something out of a nightmare. This is one of those. I mostly fly an Airbus H125, a single-engine workhorse that's perfect for the Rockies. It's got enough power for high-altitude work, which matters when you're flirting with 10,000 feet and up during a rescue. I take off from Salt Lake, and within minutes the flats turn into rising teeth of rock. The air gets thin fast. You can feel it in the way the controls respond, in the way the engine hum changes pitch. At altitude, every mistake is amplified. You have to baby the power. No sudden collective pulls. No sloppy flying. The H125 can take a lot, but up there, the margin for error shrinks to almost nothing. And the Rockies? They're breathtaking. They're also moody as hell. One minute you've got clear blue skies that look like something off a postcard. The next, some sneaky downdraft off a ridge slams you with turbulence hard enough to jolt your teeth, or a snow squall comes out of nowhere and suddenly you're flying in a gray-white tunnel, visibility cut to almost zero. Even on a good weather day, the work can be insane. More than once I've had to hover in tight mountain bowls, tail rotor just a few yards from the trees, main rotor spinning maybe 20 feet above the tree line. I'll be holding steady knuckles white while my crew lowers the hoist down to some shivering, injured climber clinging to a rock face with a broken leg. The hoist is our lifeline. When we can't land, the cable goes down and we pull people out of places they never should have been in. But hoists don't fix everything. So we stack our bird with whatever else we can fit: night vision goggles, high-intensity searchlights, Rayco detectors to ping reflective strips and jackets when you're flying search and rescue missions in the Utah Rockies. You take every advantage you can get, and you still end up in situations like this one. Most rescues start the same way: my phone buzzing on the nightstand, dragging me out of sleep, the world still fuzzy. That night was no different. A man's wife had called 911. Her husband hadn't. He come home from a solo hike near Hayden Peak. Nothing I hadn't heard before. Solo hiker, underestimated the mountains, maybe took a wrong trail, maybe ignored the forecast. Honestly, I wasn't expecting anything crazy. The last few ops were textbook. Out-of-shape city guys who thought a day hike would look good on Instagram, and then panicked the moment the trail got steep. I figured this was just another one. We flew out, sweeping the area around Farm Creek Peak first. Nothing at all. No bright jackets. No smoke, no reflective glint. The ground teams were already out there, engines growling along the trails on ATVs, checking the obvious routes and side paths. No sign. So we widened the search, higher, deeper, eventually. We were flying toward Wilson Peak, the highest point in Utah. The terrain up there is vicious. Sheer drops, deep snowpack, jagged ridges like shark fins. Honestly, it was a long way from where the guy was supposed to be. I didn't expect to find a damn thing. But then my co-pilot leaned into the thermal screen and muttered, "Hold up. I've got something." A tiny heat signature, faint, human-shaped, perched on a narrow bluff at about 8,000 feet. I banked closer, squinting out the window. And there he was, the missing hiker. He was sitting near the edge of a ledge, exposed to the elements, no tent, no pack, no visible supplies. Just a thin jacket, his face hollowed out, and one arm lifting in the weakest wave I'd ever seen. It looked like every bit of energy he had left was going into that tiny movement. I could tell just from his posture. He was right on the line between bad and too late. I got on the radio. Sent his coordinates to the ground team, let them know we have visual. They swung their ATVs around and started trying to work up toward him. Then we waited, hovering, watching. 20 minutes later, the radio crackled again. The ground lead's voice sounded grim. Approach is iced over and too steep. We can't get to him safely from below, not without ropes. We'll need climbers and gear. That's at least 2 hours. 2 hours. I looked down at the man on the bluff. He didn't have 2 hours. I met my co-pilot's eyes. He didn't even have to say it. Screw it. We're going in low. Drop the line. What I did next. Let's just say, if an FAA inspector had been sitting behind me, I'd probably have lost my license on the spot. Regulations say you keep a safety buffer for wind shear and rotor wash. You don't thread a helicopter into tight, gusty terrain unless you're insane or desperate. But I dipped the nose anyway, easing us between the pines and the rock contours, coming in sideways until the altimeter started screaming at me. Warning, warning, we were within about 50 feet of the bluff, far too low for a winch operation in those winds. In the back, my hoist medic Tony Reyes, guy's got nerves of steel, clipped himself to the cable, gave me a thumbs up and stepped out into nothing. I held the hover. Hands locked, breath shallow, the mountain wind pawing at the machine like it wanted us dead. Tony swung under us, boots scraping the rock, and edged his way toward the hiker. From above, I watched through the side window. Tony kneeling, talking close to the man's ear, checking if he could stand. He couldn't, he was done. His limbs just weren't listening to him anymore. Tony manhandled him into the harness, tugged the crotch strap into place and glamorous but life-saving signaled us, and we started lifting. We didn't have the luxury of hanging around. Fuel was burning. The wind was rising. Down the valley, I'd already picked out a flat meadow clear, big enough to land and stabilize the guy. I turned us that way, co-pilot working the hoist controls, hauling Tony and the hiker up like rag dolls. We flew the short distance, set them down in the meadow, and then landed nearby ourselves. When the rotors finally spun down and the world went quiet, except for the groan of the wind through the trees, we stepped out to go see just what we'd pulled off that mountain. The hiker sat propped against a fallen log, swaddled in foil blankets, his skin the color of wet paper. Tony was setting up in 4, moving with the bored precision of a man who's seen this 100 times and still cares every single time. But something about the guy was wrong in a way I couldn't put my finger on. He'd been missing less than 24 hours, according to his wife, yet he looked like he'd been out there for days. His cheeks were sunken, his lips cracked. His tongue was so swollen from dehydration that his words stumbled out thick and slow. And then there was the really strange part. He didn't seem to remember his own name, not immediately. Hypothermia slows people down, makes them clumsy, confused. But their core identity usually hangs on. It's one of the last things to go. When we asked his name, he just stared at us, not like he was refusing, like he was searching for something that wasn't there. Glass-eyed, lost. After a full minute or two, you could see it snap back into place like he'd just remembered a phone number from high school. He finally whispered his name. I knelt down beside him. Hey, buddy, what happened up there? How'd you end up in that spot? He broke eye contact, blinking, staring past me at the tree line for a long moment. Then he said very quietly that he didn't remember, not really. All he could piece together was this: he'd been hiking alone. At some point, he realized someone was following him. He panicked and ran. Everything else between that moment and waking up on the bluff, just black. He remembered flashes, running, climbing, feeling absolutely certain something or someone was right behind him, and then nothing. The next clear memory was sitting on that ledge, too exhausted to go up or down, knowing he wasn't going to make it through the night. By then, the ground team arrived on their ATVs. Medics flooded in, doing their usual routine, strapping him down, checking vitals, muttering in medical shorthand. I hoped he'd open up more as he warmed up. That maybe the details would come back and this would be just another weird but explainable rescue. But they didn't. His memory stayed foggy. No matter who asked or how. They loaded him up and sent him to the AN Provo. The paramedics were confident. Once his body recovered, so would his mind. They'd get a timeline. They'd get answers. We flew back to base, debriefed, filled out the paperwork, the whole bureaucratic victory lap. We'd saved a life. We should have been celebrating. Instead, we just sat around in that half-lit room, coffee going cold, replaying the whole thing in our heads. Because nothing added up. The bluff where we found him near Wilson Peak was almost a day's hike from where he started near Hayden. It was roughly 15 miles as the crow flies, and that doesn't even account for brutal terrain, snow, and elevation gain. For an experienced mountaineer, that would be one hell of a push in good conditions. For a casual weekend hiker from the flatlands with no climbing background at night and snow, it borders on impossible. And then there was the bluff itself. It wasn't some gentle slope. It was the kind of terrain climbers classify as Class 5, scrambling against near vertical faces, the point where one bad handhold can mean a lethal fall. Normally, someone like him wouldn't even attempt it without gear, let alone in a blind panic. Yet somehow, with no rope, no harness, no helmet, he'd made it up there in the snow without breaking his neck. The investigators later checked his story. They looked for a second set of tracks in the snow below. They canvassed the park for reports of suspicious people. Nothing, no sign of any pursuer, no tracks except his own. He healed, physically. He went home, hugged his wife, kissed his kids. But his memory stayed like Swiss cheese, full of holes. The last solid thing he remembered was realizing he was being followed. After that, just terrified fragments and blackouts. I've replayed it in my head more times than I can count. What scares a man so badly that he turns into a mountain goat overnight? The most reasonable answer is a bear. A big black bear rearing up on two legs, maybe bluff charging him. The kind of sight that kicks every ancient survival instinct into overdrive. Maybe it was a mama bear with cubs. Those are terrifying. I've seen full-grown men almost cry when one starts closing distance, but even that doesn't quite line up. The distance, the climb, the lost time, the other option? It wasn't an animal at all. It was a man. A man moving through the trees, patient. A man who liked to watch hikers panic and run, leading them higher, farther, until they trapped themselves on some impossible ledge. The kind of predator who doesn't need claws or fangs, just time. Both explanations are terrifying, and neither one fully explains what we saw that day. I think that's what bothers me most. There's no neat ending. No satisfying answer. Just a man who should be dead, somehow alive, sitting on a ledge he never should have reached. And a stretch of mountains that might still be hiding whatever chased him there. Part 2. The Man I Almost Married. Denver, Patrick's story. When I was 28, I was still living in Denver. One night, a group of friends and I went out for dinner and drinks. It was the usual city night. Clinking glasses, loud laughter, music too high for deep conversation. At first, it was fun. But as the sky darkened and the alcohol flowed, something in me just disconnected. That summer, I'd thrown myself into yoga, running, and clean eating. The late nights and drunken chaos that once felt exciting now just left me feeling drained and off balance. So, after one last drink, I decided I'd had enough. I hugged my friends, stepped outside into the cool air, and started looking for a cab. That's when I heard a man's voice to my right. "Are you waiting for a cab too?" That's how I met Patrick. Turned out we were in almost the same situation. He'd been out celebrating his brother's birthday, but he'd stopped drinking years earlier, and watching everyone else get sloppy wasn't his idea of a good time. So he'd bailed early, hoping to avoid babysitting a bunch of drunk adults. I liked that about him immediately, a guy who didn't drink. Who knew when to call it a night? We quickly learned we were both single, about the same age, and we clicked fast easy banter, shared sarcasm, the kind of gentle flirting that warms up the space between strangers. We were so absorbed in talking that we almost missed an empty cab drifting by. By the time we noticed, it was already gone. The next one that pulled up, Patrick insisted I take. "Ladies first," he said with a half smile. "I'll catch the next one." He was polite, handsome and charming without trying too hard. So when he asked for my number and later texted about grabbing coffee, I didn't hesitate to say yes. We started dating. 2 years later, we were deeply in love. Patrick was close to perfect. Except for one shadow he never fully let me into, his past. Now, in most situations, a guy being cagey about his history is a big red flag, but Patrick wasn't a brick wall. He talked about high school, about building his career, about exes. He told stories about his childhood, his relationship with his parents, normal stuff. The only time he'd go vague was when college came up. He admitted he'd spent his first 2 years drunk and reckless, partying constantly. He said it got so bad he had to repeat some classes during his sophomore year. He hinted at falling in with a bad crowd, people who brought out the worst in him. He made it clear he was ashamed of that version of himself, and I believed him. I saw the man he was now, disciplined, thoughtful, sober, steady. I decided not to dig too hard into his regrets. People grow, people change. I liked that he owned his past without wallowing in it. Then one day, Patrick asked me something that surprised me. He asked if I wanted to go hiking. Now that might not sound strange, but for Patrick, it was almost bizarre. He was not an outdoors guy. At all, he liked the idea of nature from a distance, preferably through a window. He went to an indoor gym, loved tech gadgets, and considered roughing it to be a hotel without room service. So when he suddenly suggested a hike near Golden Gate Canyon State Park, I was caught off guard, but in a good way. 6 months earlier, we'd had one of those late-night, half-serious, half-fantasy conversations about marriage and kids. Not exactly planning our future together, more like, if you ever got married, how would you want it to happen? Patrick asked me what my dream proposal would look like. He tossed out the usual. A bridge in Central Park, the top of the Eiffel Tower, some perfect tourist postcard. But I told him honestly, I'd rather be proposed to someplace natural, not man-made, a place where the view was earned, not bought. A mountain overlook, a cliff at sunset, somewhere beautiful and quiet. He'd nodded, filing it away with that "I'm listening more than I look like" expression of his. I never thought he'd actually remember, so when he suggested that hike, I felt something in my chest flutter. I started texting my friends in a panic. I think he's going to propose. I don't know if I'm ready. What do I do? I loved him. I really did. I just wasn't sure I was ready for the weight of marriage. What if it changed everything? What if we weren't as strong as I thought? My friends all said the same thing. You're overthinking. Go. Enjoy it. Say yes if it feels right. They were right about one thing. When I imagined him asking, I felt more excited than scared. The morning of the hike, the weather was perfect. The sky was clear, just a few wisps of cloud. The air was cool, the kind that wakes you up without biting. The Rockies in the distance looked painted layers of blue and gray and green. Patrick showed up with a backpack ridiculously overprepared for a supposedly casual hike. He'd packed a proper first aid kit, high-end trekking poles, a couple of those fancy water filter straws, a solar-powered phone charger, extra socks, energy bars. Typical Patrick. If he was going to be outdoors, he was going to do it with gear that could survive the apocalypse. The first couple of hours were pure bliss. We walked shaded trails, the sun flickering between trees, the smell of dirt and pine rising with each step. We joked, we reminisced, we brushed hands. We were just happy. Then the trail turned steep. Patrick led us up a narrow path that wound its way to a high earthen cliff overlooking a huge sweep of forest below. The view was staggering peaks in the distance, a carpet of trees, a sky that felt endless. I felt tears prickling in my eyes. This was it. This had to be it. Patrick looked at me, smiling softly. You know what I'm going to ask, right? I laughed, cheeks wet. Yes, I braced for him to kneel. He didn't. Instead, he took a breath. There's something I have to tell you first. My happiness hiccuped. Right away I got nervous. I thought he might reassure me with something like, don't worry, it's nothing crazy. But he didn't. He stayed quiet for a few long seconds. Then he asked me if I loved him, if I trusted him. I said yes, of course I did. He asked if I could keep a secret, the most important secret of his life. Again, I said yes. I had no idea how wrong I was. Patrick began talking about college. His second year, specifically, He told me he and some frat buddies had gone to an off-campus warehouse party like a rave. Music, flashing lights, cheap liquor in plastic cups. He said those were his worst days, constantly drunk, constantly looking for trouble. At that party, he started talking to a girl. They hit it off, started making out, and eventually she asked him to come back inside and dance with her. He said yes, ran off to grab another drink. When he came back, she was gone. He looked for her for a while, no luck. When he finally spotted her again, half an hour later, she was barely conscious. Completely out of it. He said at the time he thought it was just booze, but knowing what he knows now, it was almost certainly something else, something in her drink. He tried to convince her to come with him. He said his plan was to bring her back to the frat house. That's how he told it anyway. But she was barely able to stand, drifting in and out. At some point she muttered no. And Patrick didn't take her home. He took her to a dark, isolated corner instead, and he did things to her. Things she couldn't consent to. Things he admitted he's never forgiven himself for. I could feel my face twisting, my stomach turning over as he talked. He saw it. He rushed to say that it was the worst mistake of his life, that he was young, drunk, selfish, and that he'd changed. He kept saying, "I'm not that person anymore." For a moment, I thought that was the end of the story. It wasn't. After he was done with her, he left her there, passed out. He went back into the party to get another drink, because he was thirsty. That's how he phrased it, like it was nothing at the time. He didn't go to get help. He didn't check to see if she was okay. An hour passed before it even occurred to him to go back and check on her. When he did, he told his friends not to leave yet, and then he went to where he'd left her, expecting to find her sleeping. But she was awake. Awake, more sober, and very much aware of what he'd done. She was furious, rightfully. She told him she was going to the police, that she wouldn't let some frat boy get away with using her body like that. I remember feeling proud of her, this girl I'd never met. She was doing the only right thing she could in that situation. Then Patrick said something that froze my blood. He told me he snapped. In an instant, he saw his life flash before his eyes. College career destroyed. Jail time, reputation, future, all crumbling. He saw his world unraveling and decided he couldn't let that happen. He looked me in the eye and said, "I didn't mean to kill her." My whole world shifted. Patrick said he only wanted to scare her, to make her back down. But when he grabbed her, when he squeezed, he crushed her larynx. He described how her eyes went wide, how she clawed at her throat, trying to breathe, how she made this horrible sound, a kind of choking gasp, then no sound at all, how, after struggling a minute or two, she went still. He could have gotten help. He didn't. He was terrified. And in that terror, he made another choice. He left her there, dead. Then he walked back into the party and found his closest friend in the frat. He asked for a favor. Together, over the next couple of hours, they disposed of her body somewhere remote, somewhere no one would ever look. Patrick didn't tell me the exact spot, but he hinted it was in some kind of state park or forest. Suddenly, his distaste for hiking made a different kind of sense. He finished his confession with, "I'm so sorry." I'd do anything to take it back, but that was my old self. I don't think the man I am now should have to pay for what he did back then. Then he asked me if I thought that was reasonable, and that's when I realized just how precarious my situation was. We were standing on the edge of a steep drop, miles from help. If I told him the truth, that I thought he was a monster, that I wanted to walk away, that I'd never marry him, what was to stop him from pushing me? He'd already proven he knew how to dispose of a body. No one knew we were there. No one knew what he just told me. If he killed me, I'd be another missing woman, another face on a poster. My mother would never know what happened. My friends would wonder, the police might suspect him, but without a body. Who knows? I understood one thing very clearly. If I wanted to live, I had to make him believe that I was on his side. So I did something I'm still ashamed of to this day. I pretended. I told him I understood. That it was a terrible mistake, yes, but one made by a younger version of him. That the person I loved now wasn't the same man as that drunk, selfish college kid. I said I agreed that he deserved to lose his entire life over what he'd done. I even went further. I said I wasn't going to let some skank ruin what we had. The words tasted like poison in my mouth. But they got me something more important than pride? They got me time? On the way back down the trail, I leaned into the role. I asked questions, not judgmental ones, but curious ones. I asked if he worried about the body ever being found. If he feared some hiker one day stumbling across her remains. He admitted he was scared of that. He said if they ever located her and traced it back to him, that would be death penalty territory, depending on the state. We even talked insanely about what our life would look like if he were ever caught, what it would mean for us, whether I'd wait for him. After the hike, when we finally got back to his car, I felt this bizarre sense of victory. I'd survived. I'd played the part. Now all I had to do was get home, keep pretending long enough to be alone, and then call the police. When I got home, the mask fell off. I broke. I sobbed so hard I could barely breathe. First alone, then on the phone with my mother. I cried for myself, for the girl he killed, for the life I thought I was going to have. Eventually, though, the crying stopped. Or at least slowed enough to think. I packed an overnight bag, grabbed my essentials and called 911. I told them everything. I planned to stay with my mom until they arrested him. Until it was safe. I worried they might somehow let him go, lack of evidence, legal technicalities, bail. But at least I thought the process would start. Instead, when the police went to find Patrick, he was gone. Over the weeks that followed, I had long, draining conversations with Denver PD and later with 2 detectives from Arizona, where Patrick had gone to college. They were very interested in the details, where he said it happened, how the body was disposed of, anything that could help them narrow down the search area. The rough location, timeline, and description gave them a starting point in a forested area. Then came another call from an FBI agent. He wanted to know if Patrick had ever mentioned using another name, if he'd joked about fake passports, offshore accounts, anything. I said no. If he had, he'd never shared it with me. The agent never outright said it, but it was obvious what they suspected. Patrick had fled the country. They asked if he'd ever talked about places he wanted to visit. I mentioned he'd once brought up Paris and Rome, but he'd never seemed overly obsessed with travel. To this day, Patrick has never been found. Sometimes I let myself imagine the best-case scenario. I open a news site and see his face under a headline like, "Fugitive murderer captured overseas." But there's another scenario that lives rent-free in my nightmares. One night, maybe soon, there's a knock at my door. I don't check the peephole. I'm comfortable, distracted. Maybe I'm cooking, maybe I'm on my phone. I open it, and he's standing there, Patrick, smiling that familiar smile. And this time, he doesn't need to win my trust. He just needs to shut me up. For good.
Part 3. The Ghosts of Carson. You probably wouldn't guess it to look at me now, with grease under my nails and a bad back from leaning under the hoods of cars all day. But there was a time when I actually lived a pretty cool life. Before the tools and the repair bays, I spent years touring as the guitarist in a small-time rock and roll band. We were never famous. No platinum records, new stadium tours, newly... But we made just enough selling tapes, shirts, and tickets to fund our dream. Playing around America, playing shows, meeting crazy people, eating food we couldn't pronounce, and waking up in a different state every few days. We were based out of Boston, so we played New York, Philly, and anywhere that would have us. But we also booked cross-country trips, the kind where you plan an entire tour months in advance using nothing but a road map and a phone book. And that's how, in the summer of 1977, we ended up doing a Rocky Mountain tour through Utah, Wyoming, and, most relevant to the story, Colorado. One of the stops was a tiny mountain town called Lake City. They were hosting a local music festival, More family picnic than rock concert, but we were happy to play anything that got us a stage and a meal. We knew to keep it tame, so we played the softer stuff, Gordon Lightfoot covers, Neil Diamond, and a few gentle originals. My dad used to call gigs like that light duty. And honestly, he was right. It was easy, relaxed, almost like a break from the grind. After finishing our set around 5:30 p.m., we wandered around the festival grounds, eating, talking to locals, letting the mountain air wind down the adrenaline. I had a green chili bison burger, still the best burger I've ever eaten. Our bassist, the crazy one, ate a whole plate of Rocky Mountain oysters, which amused the locals to no end. If you don't know what those are, well, consider yourself lucky. That's when we met Jed. He was a friendly, local, Midwestern-looking, broad-shouldered, maybe in his 40s. He loved our Lightfoot cover, said it was his and his wife's song. That opened the door for a conversation about music in general. When we mentioned bands like Black Sabbath and Judas Priest, he jokingly accused us of being traveling Satanists. He didn't believe any of the anti-metal hysteria, of course, but he'd lived through the panic when Psycho released in 1960, when people said audiences would lose their minds. He even told us he took his teenage son to see Carrie over Thanksgiving the year before. He loved horror, which made what happened next feel fitting. After a while, Jed said he needed to head out, but paused and asked, "You boys ever want to see a real ghost town?" We all perked up instantly. We were touring musicians, meaning half the point of traveling wasn't the shows. It was the weird experiences in between, and a real ghost town that beat any roadside attraction.
Jed told us he knew a place, Carson, an abandoned mining town high in the mountains. We agreed on the spot. The next morning, bright and early, we followed Yet's truck up a long, winding gravel road into the mountains. The sun filtered through the evergreens, the air thinned as we went higher. Eventually the road ended and Jet apologized. "We gotta walk the rest of the way, maybe a mile." We didn't mind. After weeks on a cramped tour bus, walking felt like a blessing. We followed him through a dense forest trail until suddenly the trees opened up into a clearing. There it was. Carson, a dozen old wooden buildings, silent and weathered, standing like skeletons frozen in time. No roofs on some. Doors hanging. Windows empty. It looked like the set of a Western movie after everyone went home. Only this wasn't a movie set. It was real. Jed told us Carson was founded in 1889 as a silver mining settlement. For a few short years, it flourished. Almost 500 miners, plus families running stores, laundries, and bunkhouses. The American dream in miniature. Then, around 1895, everyone was gone, abandoned, wiped clean. We asked Jed what happened. He said there were two explanations. The official one, pushed by the mining company, claimed the veins had run dry and operations became unprofitable. They wanted to sell the land, so they promoted the idea that the town simply faded. But the unofficial one, the one Jed swore was true, had been whispered from generation to generation. And it was darker. Much darker. Jed said his grandfather, a former deputy sheriff, had heard the tale directly from a woman who lived in Carson as a child, one of the last to leave. His grandfather believed every word she said, and he was a man who could smell lies the way others smell baking bread. According to her, the mine didn't run dry. Something happened inside it. Something violent. Something so horrific that the town was abandoned almost overnight. Jed explained, one day the miners deep inside the mountains suddenly turned on each other. Some people said it started as a strike. Others said a fight broke out, maybe fueled by anger, alcohol, or desperation. But the people Yet's grandfather spoke to said it wasn't a fight, it was a slaughter. The first sign of trouble was gunfire echoing down the mountain. Folks in town didn't think much of it. Gunshots weren't unusual in those days. Not when hunters and trappers roamed the area, but soon wounded miners started running into town. Men covered in cuts, buckshot wounds, stab wounds, torn clothing, horror in their eyes. They babbled that something was happening in the mine, something bad. The company's off-duty guards, half of them in town either sleeping or drinking, grabbed their guns and ran up the mountain to help. Meanwhile, the townspeople tended to the wounded, waiting for the guards to return with answers, but the guards never came back. When the gunfire finally stopped, a group of townsmen climbed up to the mine to see what happened. What they saw inside nearly broke them. Bodies everywhere, dead miners, dead guards, blood coating the rock. Rivulets of it trickling down the mining shafts like red rainwater. Inside the tunnels, it was even worse. Dozens upon dozens of bodies lay crumpled, collapsed, or stacked like broken dolls. The townsmen said the blood pooled so deep in places that it began to run downhill into connected shafts, forming narrow rivers. Some miners had been blasted at point-blank range with 12-gauge shotguns. Others were hacked apart with pickaxes. Some had holes smashed into their skulls the size of fists. The injuries were so brutal that even men who had survived Rocky Mountain winters, bear attacks, and outlaw raids said they had never, ever seen anything like it. They carried the wounded out as fast as they could, but many bled out before help arrived. They would be fine 1 minute, screaming in pain but alive, then dead when rescuers came back to check. But the worst part wasn't the massacre. It was what came next. At one point, the butcher's teenage son, a boy who had run up the mountain to help, never returned. His father went into the mine to find him. He found the boy in a tunnel, swinging a pickaxe, hacking the already dead miners over and over, covered head to toe in their blood. His father called to him. The boy turned and attacked his own father. It took everything the butcher had to defend himself. In the chaos, he ended up killing his own son. The moment he did, he completely broke, screaming, crying, wailing as others dragged him out. This was when the townspeople realized something. This wasn't a riot. This wasn't anger. This wasn't alcohol. Something inside that mine had driven men insane, filled them with a murderous frenzy, turned them against friends, co-workers, even their own families. Some people blamed mass hysteria. Others blamed a contagious panic response. But many survivors insisted something else was at work, maybe toxic gas or fungal spores that triggered violent, psychotic behavior. Whatever it was, the townspeople made one unanimous decision: seal the mine forever. The walking wounded gathered all the dynamite they could find. They detonated it at the entrance, collapsing the tunnels and burying the dead and the dying beneath tons of rock. The mining company tried to recover the bodies later, but many were never found. Some locals still stumbled upon human bones in the forest below over the years. Not animal bones, human. Jed asked us if we wanted to look, maybe find a souvenir. We declined. Hard no, he laughed. We laughed. But none of us were really joking. Carson felt haunted, not by ghosts exactly, but by something heavier, something that lingered. You could feel it in the quiet. We wrapped up the visit, thanked Jed, and hit the road toward Aspen, but his story clung to me for the entire tour. When I got back to Boston, I went to the library and checked out books on mining disasters. I learned about hydrogen sulfide, the stink-damp gas known to cause hallucinations and violent delirium at high concentrations. That could explain the miners deep in the shaft losing their minds. But not everything. It didn't explain why the company guards, the ones stationed at the entrance and closer to town, supposedly turned on each other too. It didn't explain the butcher's boy. It didn't explain the sheer scale of the carnage. Even today, as an old man with calloused hands and a quieter life, I still think about Carson sometimes. I still wonder, was it really gas? Or was it something else entirely? Something that should have stayed buried in that mountain long before anyone ever dug the first shaft? Part 4. The cave that should have stayed silent. Most people never think about who deals with the dead when they're found in strange places. They imagined detectives, maybe a ranger, maybe a coroner with a clipboard, but in reality, when someone discovers human remains, especially old ones, it's usually me they call first. I'm a medical examiner, and part of my job involves going out to remote places to determine how and why someone died. Sometimes that means hiking through swamps. Sometimes it means standing in the middle of a cornfield. And sometimes, like this story, it means flying up into the Rockies by helicopter. This happened back in October of 2007, on a crisp morning when the leaves had already turned and the air had that sharp bite that warns winter is coming. A retired day hiker was out exploring the North Lateral Moraine Trail. He enjoyed something he called pioneer relic hunting, meaning he liked shining his flashlight into old cracks, hollows, and shallow cave systems, hoping to find abandoned bits of pottery or tin cans from the pioneer days. That morning he found something very different. He found bones, scattered across the floor of a small car stave just off the trail. At first he assumed they were animal bones, deer maybe, but then he found the skull, human, white, aged-looking, bleached by time. He called it in, thinking he'd stumbled on some relic from the Old West, maybe even Donner Party-era remains. But he was wrong, and it was my job to prove just how wrong. Since the remains were found far up in the mountains, too far for an easy vehicle approach, the department flew me, ACBI lab tech, a coroner's photographer, and 2 park rangers in by helicopter around midday. The cave wasn't really a cave, more like a crack in the granite just wide enough for a man to squeeze through. Still, the moment I stepped into it, I felt something heavy settle in my gut, the kind of instinct that comes from decades of experience. We suited up in Tyvek suits, switched on our headlamps, and began laying out a standard 10 by 10 meter baseline grid for documentation. Right away, I noticed something odd. The remains were partial, not a full skeleton, not even close. We found a detached mandible, fragments of a radius or ulna, several phalanges, thoracic vertebrae, but no pelvis and none of the long bones below the femur. In fact, the femurs, some of the most durable bones in the body, were also missing. That was the first troubling clue. The second clue was stranger. The bones looked like they had been there for decades. The cortical surfaces were etched by fine vertical striations, the kind caused by long-term exposure to freezing mountain winds. At first glance, this lined up with the hiker's assumption that they were extremely old. But as I inspected the skull under my light, something nagged at me. I saw no bite marks, no carnivore pitting, the kind of scraping or puncturing left behind by scavengers like coyotes or mountain lions. I also saw none of the delicate gnawing indicative of rodents. Instead, the bone surfaces, especially around the muscle attachment sites, showed clean stripping, uniform, precise, deliberate, the kind of stripping done by a sharp blade, not weather or animals. That was my first real jolt of unease. I took a small shard of bone and bagged it for preliminary histology, microscopic tissue analysis. We brought the sample down to a portable field unit at the trailhead and ran it through a portable FTIR spectrometer. The readout lit up like a flare. The bone showed high levels of hydroxyapatite crystallinity, unusual patterns of thermal degradation, heating between picked -220 degrees Fahrenheit, no charring. This wasn't natural decomposition. This wasn't wildfire exposure. There was only one reasonable explanation. The bones had been boiled. Simmered, specifically, hot enough to degrade soft tissue, not hot enough to char. Suddenly, those missing femurs, the bones richest in marrow, took on a grim significance. We returned to the cave with fresh dread simmering beneath our professionalism. That's when the pieces began falling into place. Near the back of the narrow granite crack, we found an old enameled iron cooking pot. Inside, clinging stubbornly to the enamel, were residues of bone marrow fats, lipids consistent with human tissue samples. High in oleic acid, low in polyunsaturated fats. The pot had been used repeatedly. We found more bones with parallel incision marks, smooth slicing patterns, microstriations indicating a carbon steel fillet knife, likely serrated. Everything pointed to one conclusion. Whoever did this removed the flesh immediately after death, butchered the body with methodical precision, and boiled the bones to extract the marrow. Not for disposal, for consumption. This wasn't survival cannibalism, the trapped in the wilderness kind. This was a hidden feast, carried out in an isolated cave deep in the Rockies by someone who clearly wanted privacy and silence. We airlifted the remains to the Denver lab, where the full postmortem unfolded over the next several weeks. The picture only grew darker. Carbon dating placed the death somewhere between 2003 and 2005, not decades old as the hiker assumed, only a few years. And no missing persons report matched the skull's dental profile. No fillings, no orthodontic work. Teeth moderately worn, suggesting someone of modest means, maybe a drifter. We extracted degraded DNA, ran it through state databases and even CODIS, the FBI's national index. Nothing, no hits, no family, no cold case overlap. We checked enamel isotopes to determine childhood water sources, a method that can reveal where someone grew up. The readings pointed to a Midwestern upbringing, but beyond that, the victim was a ghost. And there were more findings. There were no defensive wounds, no restraint marks on the wrists or ankles, no sign of struggle. That suggested the victim may have been unconscious, incapacitated, or killed somewhere else. Cause of death was most likely asphyxiation or blunt force trauma, inflicted away from the cave. The body was then transported, butchered, boiled, and partially removed for consumption. The missing long bones were almost certainly carried away for later use. Cold, efficient, purposeful, not the work of someone starving. The work of someone who enjoyed it, someone who had done it before, someone who might do it again. The case files sit now in the Colorado Bureau of Investigation's unsolved ledger, digital dust gathering on a horror story with no ending. It's been more than 6 years and the killer has never been found. Statistically, the person was likely male. The strength required for the bone processing supports that. But where is he now? Maybe living in some forgotten mountain town. Maybe drifting through the Midwest. Maybe still camping in forests, pots bubbling over with broth richer and darker than anyone would want to imagine. I try not to picture it. But sometimes, when I think back on those bones, when I think of how carefully stripped they were, how cleanly boiled, how deliberately butchered, it hits me in the gut. This wasn't desperation. This wasn't madness. This was appetite. And in this line of work, after all the autopsies and all the bodies and all the cold, sterile rooms, some fractures never heal.